All right. So thanks everyone for joining our swimmers panel debrief. Welcome, welcome. And we have a small group today, but I look forward to the conversation that we can have. My name's Karen Robinson. I'm the program director for Human Rights Ed at RFK Human Rights. And since we're a small group, maybe we can go around and do some introductions and then start talking about the swimmers and the issue of refugee and immigration and the multiple challenges in front of our global community on those issues.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Stevens. I'm the Capacity Building Program Manager at RFK Human Rights. And we're really excited that you're here with us today.
I'll go next. My name is Allison Gilmore. I am the Youth Engagement Program Associate with the Speak Truth to Power team here at RFK Human Rights. I'm also super excited for this conversation today.
Hey, my name is Anthony Enriquez, and I'm the Vice President of U.S. Advocacy and Litigation here at RFK Human Rights. I have a background prior to RFK in working with young asylum seekers and other migrants who arrive to the United States.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Eileen, and I am just a wonderful, happy guest to be here and just excited for the conversation.
Excellent. So let's start with the question that Rebecca posed before we joined about what were some of the more compelling parts of the movie The Swimmers for you? And what are some of the questions that you had, or I know Rebecca's daughters had, or others about either what happened in Syria, the immigration challenges, kind of anything within all of that, getting to the Olympics, what that takes. So why don't can I throw it to you, Allison, to start?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the most compelling part for me was, of course, the journey on the boat. And I think the scene where there's just all those life jackets, like I had so many questions going in my head, like, what is the symbolism behind, this massive field of life jackets? Are these lives lost? Are these people who didn't get to make it on the journey? So that to me was kind of emotional for me.
Elaine or Rebecca?
I think for me, it was the how vulnerable the refugees were at every single juncture and how they really had to depend on either the generosity of others or be at the whim of others. And so it really led me to some questions about what kind of protections are in place for refugees in various areas, and sort of what can we do?
I think for me, I found I was still processing a lot of what I watched. It was very moving. And I think that it was very honest. And that's what I liked about it. So it was a lot for those people to go through all the time. It just never stopped,
Porter, welcome. As you see in the chat, we have a small group this afternoon, so we're just welcoming everyone to join the panel so we can have this conversation. If you want to or not, it's up to you, but welcome. Anthony, how about you? We'll throw it to you.
I think, similar to Rebecca, to me, it was interesting the contrast between the European system and the U.S. system, which I'm very familiar with. I worked for many years as a lawyer for unaccompanied immigrant youth arriving to the United States, and so was really well versed in how it is that we treat children coming to our country, where it is we house them, what do you do with a child who has no place to sleep at night. but the groups in the swimmers were mixed of some people who are younger than 18 and others who were older than that. And so it's just seeing the contrasting reception systems in Europe versus the United States was very interesting for me.
I think for me, I've had the good opportunity, the fortunate opportunity, my brain is not working today, to have worked with a number of films that address really complex human rights issues. And what I appreciated in this film was that I feel like it really made it accessible. So regardless of whether you came to it with knowledge or not, you were able to kind of be a part of this and kind of understand the challenges that, it created a space for you to at least engage with that a bit, because it is complex and nuanced, and from the bombing in the beginning in Syria to, finally relocating, it's very complicated and nuanced. And I know that Europe isn't, like, some of that isn't your area of expertise, Anthony, or your experience. But I just would love your kind of thoughts on, how do people who watch this and want to engage somehow in this work, like, where is the place for that? Or is this really, like, not for, like, Rebecca's daughters, if they want to do something, like, where's that space, whether in the U.S. or elsewhere?
That's a great question. And I think, just as you pointed out, the complications and the nuances, there's really a nuanced answer to that. There aren't huge logistical teams in place, for instance, to go to the U.S. border and receive lots of people. But what I find consistently challenging in this work is that there is no universal response to the plight of refugees or asylum seekers. We can't necessarily assume that everyone agrees that people running from danger should be received and cared for and have the opportunity to apply for asylum. In fact, a common refrain is, well, maybe they should run, but why does it have to be here? Our country is already full. We can't help. It's sad, but we can't help everybody. And so I do think that for those who are not in the position, for instance, professionally, to work with this population, or don't have the resources to be able to travel directly, or don't have money or clothing to donate, things like that, I do think simple conversations with your neighbors, friends, and family members to really help give that space to kind of increase empathy for people is just essential. At the end of the day, the international law on asylum depends on our will as neighbors and as human beings to help other people. There's no government that's going to enforce asylum laws if it doesn't want to. And since government is made of each of our individual decisions, and at least in this democracy, it's really important for us to have those honest and searching conversations with our fellow citizens, and help explain why it is that we feel it's important to extend this hand to people in need. Because that empathetic response, I don't think we can assume that it's natural, it's necessary for everybody.
I think that's a great point that you made about that empathy isn't necessarily the common response, or and that we have to be able to get that conversation going. And I think that's really true at the end of the film, when Sarah has been arrested for going back and helping other refugees. And that was a part that was a little bit confusing to at least my daughters. They were like, well, how come she got arrested for human trafficking charges when she's actually helping refugees? Would you mind to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I have to say, this is actually a common response across governments across the world. So the mid 2010s, I hesitate to call it a crisis because you'll often see in the media reception of asylum seekers is referred to variously as a crisis or an invasion. And so what I'll say is, the greater number of people fleeing war in Syria that started to arrive to Europe in the mid 2010s, their reception was controversial. Some of you may remember, for instance, there were scenes of a reporter in the Balkans who tripped an asylum seeker that was running. It was a child, in fact, and that same controversy existed all throughout Europe. There was a lot of political and legal discussion about rehauling Europe's entire asylum system rule, which typically doesn't require a person to request asylum at the very first country that in Europe that they set foot on. And so the Greek pushback against asylum seekers and the Greek prosecution of people who were organizing to provide aid to asylum seekers is something that's occurred also in Italy. It's occurred in France. There was a famous case in France about 2 years ago of a criminal prosecution of someone who was assisting asylum seekers by providing them with shelter and transportation. And fortunately, the jury in that case decided to acquit that person. They said, we agree with what he's doing, and so we won't send this person to imprisonment. But here in the US as well, the US government has actually prosecuted groups who have organized by leaving water supplies in the desert in the American Southwest. People die in their attempts to cross into the United States and their attempts to seek asylum. And so a group of community activists called No More Deaths had been leaving water for migrants to replenish themselves. And the federal government has tried to prosecute them several times. So it's a strategy that many governments are using, really attacking small bands of people who are simply seeking to help others because they feel that it disincentivizes ultimately migration. Whether or not that is true, empirically, it doesn't seem to be true. People continue to migrate, even though conditions become even more inhospitable, even more dangerous. And so the prosecution of really small numbers of community groups, of people that are offering assistance and help, hasn't staunched that flow of people at all, and really has just served to inflict more misery on people.
Yeah, that's something I was really struck by in the film too, because you could see how many people were coming from Syria. I mean, obviously it didn't really seem to matter where they went. They just needed to leave Syria, and they were leaving en masse, like the part that Allison was talking about with all of the life jackets. Which kind of brings me to a second question. Towards the middle of the film, the sisters are in this converted airport hangar, and they seem to be kind of just in a holding pattern there for a long period of time. Do you know anything or have any background about what was happening in Germany right then? Kind of what was their status? Where did they go after that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The nature of human migration is that it actually isn't consistent year around. People respond to weather patterns. They'll be more likely to migrate when conditions are more hospitable, when it's not too cold, when it's not too hot, and oftentimes in the context of the Western Hemisphere, where people have to cross jungles and deserts in order to arrive at receiving countries. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, and I guess on that hand, you could say there is a little bit of predictability, right? We could expect that during these months of the year, there will be more people that will be arriving. And so therefore we should, as a receiving country, we should beef up our resources. We should ensure that there's proper staffing, proper housing, et cetera. And then on the other hand, there are these really sudden crises that could be a natural disaster. It could be the outbreak of a war, and those things are a little less predictable. Maybe a hurricane season is predictable, but perhaps a fire isn't. Or who knew that a war would break out between Russia and Ukraine, except for the couple weeks prior to it actually happening. And so because of that, we just don't have, and really no government in the world has, a truly adequate system for receiving and evaluating asylum claims. Because something that the movie might not have left quite clear is that the right to seek asylum under international law is a legal right that requires passage of a particular legal test. And so it isn't just, oh, my country's at war, and so therefore I get asylum in another place. It isn't just, oh, it's dangerous where I live, and so therefore I get asylum in another place. It's in fact refugee status, and for those who are confused by the term refugee or asylum, a refugee is someone who typically within their country applies for protection and is then escorted out of their country by an international organization to a safe place. An asylee, in contrast, is someone who travels to another country and finds themselves outside of their country and asks for protection once they've already arrived at the other place. Now, why would someone not always apply for refugee status? Well, because if where you are is very dangerous, it might not be safe for you to do that. There might not be an international organization on the ground that can actually do that. It might not be possible for you to get a plane out of the region where you're at. So people who are seeking asylum are people who made the choice first as a matter of survival to flee and then applied for that protection. But the protection itself is actually under law only for people who can satisfy a particular legal test, which says I have been persecuted by my government on the basis of what's called a protected characteristic. And a protected characteristic is something that many of the countries of the world, when they were signing an international human rights treaty in the 1950s to define the right to seek protection around the world, decided there are certain characteristics that are going to entitle you to protection. Things that are so fundamental to human identity that they either cannot be changed or shouldn't be forced to be changed. And those include your race, your religion, your political beliefs, something called a particular social group. And so a particular social group is people who share a common characteristic that society recognizes, and they're being punished for sharing that characteristic. So famously, an example of that are LGBTQ people, who society recognizes there's something about them that is different than the majority of the society, and who are often persecuted or punished simply for having that characteristic. But the point of creating this category of particular social group was to allow for an expanding definition of protection, so that we thought we can't define every single thing that people are going to possibly suffer persecution for. So let's create this particular social group, and let's allow circumstances to dictate what the definition of that is. Let's allow some flexibility here. But ultimately, the reason why people are stuck in makeshift airport hangars or in immigration detention here in the United States while their claims are pending, their claims for asylum are pending, is because the governments that are evaluating those claims don't assign enough resources to timely evaluate those claims. It's simply a matter of there's not enough staff power, funding that is given to these offices to timely evaluate these claims. And so it will, on average, take anywhere from 3 to 5 years in the United States, once you've made your asylum claim, to actually have it go before an immigration judge and to receive your day in court. There are currently, the Biden administration proposed a new system for asylum claims whereby you could be on an expedited basis interviewed by an asylum officer who could evaluate what your claim, whether or not it was entitled to asylum. And then if you were rejected by that asylum officer, you could either accept that rejection and return to your home country, or you could appeal that rejection to an immigration judge. But if you appeal, then you're in it for the long haul. It's going to take you probably 3 to 5 years before you get a final decision on your case.
So in that interim in the United States, like if you go, you're seeking asylum, what happens to you in the meantime? Like what rights do you have here? Are there worries? Where do you stay? Those kinds of things.
So the right to seek asylum in the United States is something that Congress codified in a statute in 1980, which was really close to 2 decades after the United States signed an international treaty, the Refugee Convention, which was signed in the 1950s, and then the International Refugee Protocol, which set some procedures for evaluating asylum claims, which was signed in 1967. It really took an additional 13 years for the government to finally set up a processing system under domestic U.S. law. And under that system, which has really remained largely unchanged since the 1980s, people have a right to apply for asylum, a right to go before an immigration judge, a right to appeal that decision if it's denied to an appeals board. And the government also has the right to appeal the grant of asylum to the appeals board. So that's something else that we do that clogs the system. We could just say, just as we do with the criminal case, well, you won your case, and so we're not going to appeal it. But we don't do that. Our immigration system says, nope, we really don't like you. We're going to appeal your case to the appeals board and make this go on even longer. So the right to apply for asylum exists. The right to see a judge. You don't have a right to a lawyer. You can bring your own lawyer, but there's no government appointed counsel as there is in the criminal context, not even for unaccompanied children. Children as young as 3 years old do not have a right to an attorney. And so they are simply sitting there before an immigration judge, and the immigration judge has to decide how much time she wants to devote to developing this child's claim, whether or not she wants to make the effort to call family in the home country and decide what was it that this child was fleeing from? How did this child get here? What is this child's story, etc. There is a right, once you've filed for asylum and passed a certain age, to apply for an employment authorization document. So a year after your asylum application is pending, you can receive what's called a work permit, an employment authorization document, and you can legally work in the United States as an asylum seeker. But you're not entitled to public benefits. That was in the 1990s under the Clinton administration. A big target of the Clinton administration was what's called welfare reform at the time. And under that reform, they outlawed the awarding of any type of public assistance to non-citizens, to usually to non-green card holders, although even some green card holders are not eligible for public benefits. Now, individual states can decide that they might grant a state benefit to an immigrant. So in New York, for instance, where I practice law, the New Yorkers who have pending asylum applications could be eligible for state-based medical health insurance under a status is called person residing under the color of law. So basically, if the government knows you're here, if you're not undocumented in the sense that they have your name in the system and they're just waiting to adjudicate your application, then you can apply for health insurance. But that's going to vary state to state. Obviously, states that have more welcoming policies, states that have been historical receivers of immigrants, California, New York, states whose economies very much benefit from the arrival of immigrants, they've made that policy decision to make sure that people who are working can also be people who are healthy, people who can attend school, etc. And on schooling in the United States as well, the Supreme Court in the 1980s reached a decision that all children in the United States, regardless of their immigration status, have a right to attend school. But the whole entire reason that case got to the Supreme Court was because there was a county in the state of Texas that was saying, we don't want to educate these kids. They are a drain on taxpayers' dollars. They're not U.S. citizens, so we shouldn't have to do that. Which just goes to show the depth of the controversy here, right? People are willing to keep children illiterate in order to send a message about immigration.
There's a question here from Jeffrey. He says, did the immigrants forced, let's see,
To New York,
New York,
Massachusetts.
yeah, benefit from the things that you just mentioned versus those still in Texas?
And Philadelphia. Philadelphia got them too.
Mhm.
Right. So people who were bused or flown across country to Massachusetts, to New York, to DC, to Philadelphia, etc. Oftentimes, those cities were not their ultimate destinations. And so if they choose to stay in those receiving states, then yes, they could potentially benefit from one particular state's decision to open health care to undocumented or immigrants, or to immigrants whose applications for asylum are pending. But oftentimes what we find is, people don't come to the United States just because they believe it's the land of gold, the freedom, everything's going to be great as soon as I get here. They come, one, because they want to work, because they say, I'm capable of working and I want to be able to do that. I came for a better life. Was something that, if you spend the time to talk to people, almost universally you hear, I came for a better life, whether it's a child, whether it's an adult. But oftentimes people come because they have a community that's already here, whether it is an aunt, a cousin, a sibling who arrived decades ago and has been working, who owns a home, and has been told by that family member or that community member, you can stay with me while you get on your feet, while your work authorization application is pending, you can stay with me, I'll take care of you. And then once you get on your feet, you can make your way in the US. So many of those people who were bused were really just looking for some way to get closer to their ultimate destinations, which they had in mind. Anecdotally, I still have former colleagues who are working in the New York space. Anecdotally, I was told that many more of the recent arrivals who are Venezuelans didn't have those diaspora communities. And so that does present a more complex problem. If someone doesn't have a place to go, what do we do with them? in the immediate term, to make sure that they don't end up like too many New Yorkers as homeless people on the street, right? As people who are unhoused, who don't have a place to sleep at night. If it's going to take them a full year just to get their employment authorization, and then they have to find a job after that, how do we ensure that these people survive before then? So those are the complex issues. And that was what struck me, was that Germany, for instance, seems to have, at least with the, I remember when one of the sisters said there's no door on the shelter here, on these bunk beds. And I thought, yes, but there's a place to sleep at least, and that so often doesn't happen. In the US, there's no federal system for housing. The federal system for housing for immigrants in the US is detention. It's a jail cell. And so either you're in a jail cell while your immigration case is pending, or you were released, typically under supervised release or on a bond, and it's up to you to find out where you're going to sleep that night.
I'm going to kind of spin this because Elaine, you're in Arizona. So as you watch the film The Swimmers and listening to Anthony, you're saying that this is, kind of so current to what you're thinking. How did watching The Swimmers, like, were there things that you observed in that film that kind of struck close to home, or that?
Yeah, it was very interesting. Just the social dynamics of the opposing ideas, and how some people felt like, we should be isolating ourselves and not letting anyone in. These are things I hear in conversation here, even, at the coffee shop, or, and just, it is so relevant to what's happening here in Arizona. Because we have waves of people coming and they're seeking help and shelter and getting on. And then we have resistance to it, and different organizations. And then we have organizations down there giving water. So just as you guys are speaking, it's just helping me to solve problems, and maybe in my next meeting, be able to have more empathy, to look at this as, how do we help these people even more? How do we become more empathetic and more compassionate? Because I've been in these detention centers, the one in Tucson, where they keep the children. I've seen it firsthand. So it moves me when I see it. And I just hope that we can help somehow more.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you. It was interesting. I had the opportunity 5 years ago to attend a conference in Athens called Refugee Welcoming Cities. And part of the challenge, they had mayors from like Lesbos and other islands saying that they just didn't have the infrastructure to handle what was coming at them, right? But believed, like, they were like, these are people, not problems. We need, like, the problem is the infrastructure, not the people coming. So, it strikes me, particularly watching this movie and listening to you, Anthony, and the depth of your knowledge and experience here. It makes me think about the scope of our human rights work, right? Like, it is all about political will, and where does a government make a decision to uphold its duty and obligation, where doesn't, right? And sometimes that requires resources, right? That makes it even more complicated and makes it more, I think, sometimes dependent on whose voice is the loudest, right? Like, who's yelling the loudest to ensure that children have access to something when they cross a border, or that, but it's the full spectrum of our human rights work, right? And as activists, and particularly as human rights educators, how do we create that space where people, that I appreciate you saying that, Ellen, and listening to you, Anthony, how do we create spaces where people can broaden their knowledge and understanding, and broaden the lens through which they see and understand the world we live in, so that when we take actions, and whether it's something really small in community or something bigger about, contributing to a periodic review to the UN on your country, like, everywhere in there, we're doing that with this grounding of human rights and our duty and responsibility to protect, promote, and defend those. Yeah, so I appreciate you all so much. This is so helpful in just thinking about how we do our work and how we care about one another.
And I do think, Cam, what you're saying, it's really important. I mean, we talk about extending empathy to immigrants and migrants and asylum seekers themselves, but part of having these conversations is extending a little bit of empathy to people who aren't sympathetic to this, to the plight of other people. And, I've known many people, been doing this work for a long time. I've known many people of goodwill, friends, colleagues, family members, myself, who I think don't quite appreciate or have difficulty just really seeing and imagining what it would be like to be on the other side. So I think a common reaction I've heard is, well, if you have a house, you wouldn't just let anybody come into your house because they needed a place to sleep. So it's the same thing with your country. But it's a little bit more complex than that. A country isn't just a house, and there are all sorts of ways that we choose to let some people into the country and not let other people in the country. Many people don't realize that actually the greatest source of undocumented immigration to the U.S. are people who initially received visas to come here, came, and then overstayed them. And in that overstay process became undocumented. And so the asylum seekers and the people who are arriving to the border on foot seem like, or they might be coming in great numbers, but they're actually smaller compared to the people who had more money, had the ability to apply for a visa, wait safely for it in their country, purchase an airplane ticket, and then came to the US and were flouting immigration laws, quote unquote, themselves through that process. I think a lot of people don't understand really, truly what it is to flee, to have this feeling that I can't survive if I stay here. And I think the movie did a really wonderful job of hitting that home. Those sisters didn't want to leave their country, right? Sarah was very happy, and we saw her living a full life in Syria at the beginning of the movie, going out with her friends, enjoying herself, and then suddenly receiving text messages that another friend, another classmate of hers had been killed. And so it really was a matter of life and death. And especially when you're in a country where most of your material needs are met, it's difficult for people to really, I think, connect with that feeling. Oftentimes, and this is not to trivialize the experience of anybody who's had to undertake these types of journeys, but I've often tried to humanize it and connect with people by saying, well, I grew up gay in the South in the 1990s, and that was a very different time then. And I just remember thinking, I have to leave this place. I have to get out of here because I can't live a full life when I'm here. And it was so easy for me to take an airplane to a different state in the United States, but crossing many, many state borders to get there in order to really fully realize my own potential and to self-actualize. And I think anybody who's sort of had that experience of having to leave their parents' house in order to discover what it is to become a full human being, in order to pursue their own dreams, maybe that kind of thinking back to what that process was like can help them connect and understand with the drive that other people feel to migrate in order to become that full version of themselves. Because I also want to be clear that the criteria that we award asylum to, that we grant people asylum, it's quite narrow. And so many people become obsessed, opponents of asylum, for instance, become obsessed with this idea. Well, most people are just economic migrants. They're just coming to make more money. They're just coming to, they're not really in danger. And so therefore they don't deserve to be here. But I've always thought, don't we all deserve, from a human rights perspective, don't we all deserve a space where we can flourish, where we can self-actualize, where we can give and receive the best of ourselves in order to help our fellow human beings? And so, I've worked with many people whose cases didn't quite fit the criteria for asylum under our laws. And we really had to do some creative thinking in order to figure out a way, as a lawyer, what was the best defense they would have to deportation.
Anthony, I really love that you brought up that humanizing part, because it really helps put into perspective. I feel like a lot of people assume that asylum seekers and refugees, do not still have an inherent love for their home country. And I think a lot of people see places like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran as these very war-torn countries. But when I talk to my immigrant and refugee students in Austria, they still very much love their country. They just hated the situation that was going on. And they tell me stories about how beautiful it was, and, how their parents worked as this and as that. And the perspective of the people living in Western countries like Germany, Greece, Austria, etc., it's very different than what the experience is. And I think it's that lack of humanization. So I'm really grateful that you brought that up, because I think it would really alter people's perspectives if we thought more as these people as regular people like us, and not refugees and asylum seekers coming from a really bad situation.
I think one of the things that I run into when I talk to people about this is there's a real fear, especially for opponents of asylum seekers, that we just don't have enough. There's not enough to go around. And so because there's not enough, then we just have to take a hard line. In thinking about how to start these conversations to kind of build empathy, what would you say to people who have that fear?
I mean, this is a group question, right? I think we can all brainstorm answers. And a lawyer is not going to be better at thinking about the best way to talk to people about their fear than anyone else. But, it's a scarcity mentality, all right? That's what it is. It's that if I give love to you, then I won't have enough love to give to them, right? And I think ask any parent of 2 or more children, they're not going to say, well, yeah, as soon as I had my second child, I loved my first one less. And so, there is enough goodwill. I think maybe people would respond to my comment there saying, yeah, but I'm not talking about goodwill. I'm talking about there's not enough housing, right, for the people that are here in this country. There aren't enough jobs. I have a friend who can't find a job, and there's just not enough of those kinds of material resources for people. What we can say is that sociologically, there have been studies done, economically, there's been studies done that that's not true, that areas that experience greater levels of immigration are actually more economically prosperous than areas that don't. Typically it's not resources that are posing the greatest challenge for immigrants and for integration here in the U.S. It's instead it's political will, right? It's that there's a clash of culture, that people feel, well, it makes me uncomfortable to hear a different language. The place that I knew, the food that I used to eat, the religion that I worshipped, the language that I heard spoken in the streets, those things are changing in my hometown, and I'm not ready for them to change. So I oppose new people coming in. But life has changed, right? Nothing is permanent. And these are quite deep questions that we're talking about, that don't pose easy answers. So I'd love to hear other people's perspective on how we would start to answer those questions.
I love living in a neighborhood where Lao is spoken, Spanish is spoken, English is spoken. I have French Canadian neighbors. I think that's the beauty of living in America. We're a melting pot. We need to have the new cultures here. It's a blessing in disguise. All these wonderful people who want to come here, they're coming, they have gifts for us. New talents, new skills, new ideas, new perspectives, new food, new beautiful fashion. There's just so many amazing things that because we open our borders and we allow people to immigrate into our country and become part of us, and no matter what their background is, it's what makes us so beautiful. It's that diversity. It's what makes us who we are. And so when people talk to me and tell me we don't have enough, I always just say to them, I'm like, there's always more, and there's always another way. So that's how I kind of deal with it when I hit it. And it does come up quite often out here. There's a lot of that here. So I use the less.
I think something that I did a lot when I was living in Austria, which is, I mean, fairly homogeneous. It's 9 million people. Most folks are Austrian or European. But what I used to do with my students, I used to challenge them because I don't think they really knew what the word xenophobia was. I don't think they really knew, what it meant. But I spent a lot of time just talking with them about differences between appropriation and assimilation and the things that they love versus the things that they don't feel okay with. So I asked them, like goulash is now a part of, Austrian culture because Hungarian goulash, a Hungarian Austro Empire. But you also love, there's a dish that's from Turkey that all Austrians eat, and it's really good. So it's like, why is it that, we love the food, we love the culture, but we still get uncomfortable when we hear people speaking Turkish, but we want to say things like, Inshallah, the students were really big on saying Inshallah, but they weren't Muslim. But then they also had issues with the jobs. And I think I just spent a lot of time just questioning them. Okay, but why? But why? And, these are your classmates. These are your friends. Some of this hurts some of us. How would you feel if you hurt me as a Black woman? And my students were like, Allison, but we love you, but we love you. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't get to choose to love me and choose to not like somebody else. It's essentially the same thing. So I think really breaking it down in that perspective really helped my students to see, okay, I can't pick and choose when I get to love something.
And I like that we've talked about humanization and humanizing. And I think, when you see a film that's done as well as The Swimmers or resources or conversations like that, and we can humanize more, we can stop the othering, because I think that also makes it so easy. It's like, well, that's, let's keep the others away and out. But, to your point, Anthony and others have raised it, like when we recognize the humanity, it's harder to do that. Even when conversations about the material needs are there. And I always talk to students about like really understanding, there's the base level, but then there's also the political dynamic, right? The political will. And somebody has power and wants to keep power. And by creating that othering and the fear and the anxiety about what we have and what we're going to lose, that allows a power dynamic to be maintained, right? And if we can understand kind of the layers of how we get there, and then how we can deconstruct that and kind of break that down, maybe we can get to that place. And I believe that's what our work is about, where, everybody is thrilled about a neighbor that's speaking a different language on every corner, and that we have this beautiful tapestry of who we are. But we need to break through some of that political reality too, right? That are cultivating that to maintain power, right? That's part of that education for human rights, right? How are we going to change that?
And actually, specifically to that point, Karen, I'll say that it's not as partisan as people might think, right? It's not that, oh, only one side is treating immigrants like this, or is keeping these policies online. This is really a bipartisan tradition of expansion of immigration detention, of criminalization of immigration, of using violence and force against immigrants. I started practicing law under the Obama administration, and his administration, he had the moniker of being called the deporter in chief by immigrant activists at the time. And of course, Donald Trump is pretty infamous for his own immigration policies. And here at RFK Human Rights, we've spoken truth to power about some really horrible initiatives that the Biden administration has undertaken, including trapping close to 15,000 Haitian and other Black immigrants and asylum seekers in open air cages in a border camp at Del Rio, Texas, and then using horses to drive them back across the border, carrying on a really shameful, decades-long tradition of opposition to Haitian migration that included opening up the world's first HIV internment camp in Guantanamo Bay for Haitians that were seeking to immigrate to the United States. So the political will, it's not just a question of red or blue. This is really about people who are fundamentally politically powerless because they don't have the right to vote, and in many ways are encouraged to remain invisible for their own safety, versus those who do have that power, and figuring out, you know, what does it take for you to loosen that grip on power.
So we're closing out the hour. This has been awesome. So I'm just going to ask if we can do just like a quick last once around. We'll start with you, Rebecca. Any last thoughts to close out our time? And again, with much appreciation, and to everyone, particularly you, Anthony, for such really important information, and yeah, really with much appreciation. So Rebecca, do you want to do a quick little one around, and then we can call it an afternoon?
Sure. Thank you, Anthony, so much for your expertise. And thank you, Eileen, for participating too. And Allison, for your perspectives about what it was like to teach in Austria. It gave me a lot to think about, really in kind of shifting and reframing some conversations, and really thinking about humanization and empathy as a starting point that we can take in our local communities, and then kind of building out from there. So thank you.
I just wanted to say very quickly that once again, this conversation, it really just blew my mind. I know we were like, oh, maybe we won't take the full hour, but I feel like, you know, there was so much that all of us gained from this conversation. And I'm really happy to see how much the world will gain, you know, just from watching this movie, knowing that it's in Netflix top 10, you know, something that you would normally see as a documentary has turned into something so beautiful. And I'm really excited to see, you know, other people's thoughts and opinions based on this movie that is clearly doing very, very well.
I'll just say,
And I just,
oh, go ahead, Eileen, sorry.
you go first.
Well, I'll say, Karen, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure, and I really love these smaller group conversations, actually, because we actually get the chance to listen to each other, to contribute our own opinions, and that's where you do your real learning from people. I just think the movie, for if anyone hasn't seen it, anyone that's watching this later hasn't seen it, it's really worth it. It's worth the time to just learn about other people's stories. It does a great job of giving a firsthand account of the just incredible travails and the dangers that people have to surpass on their migration journeys, but also the hope and the possibility that exists and that sustains people. So it's a really, really great movie, and I'm glad it's out there in the world, and hopefully it can help expand viewpoints.
And then go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, you guys. It was an incredibly thoughtful, deep conversation that helped me unwind knots of some things that I was kind of seeing repeatedly. And when I saw the film, I said, oh, this is amazing. This is very similar to what I'm experiencing out here in Arizona, but it's on a different place. But it humanized, and definitely was about humanizing what was happening, and definitely about the empathy. Definitely, I think helping me see that using empathy as a tool for conversation, it helps bring people back to reality, how important this is. So thank you very much. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Porter, I don't know if you want to chime in. If not, I'll just say speak truth to power is grounded in the idea of storytelling and using narratives to broaden the perspective through which we see and understand the world we live in. So I just want to give a huge thank you to our friends at Netflix for, providing us with this opportunity. In addition to the film, I would ask that you go to our website and check out the panel discussion. We had the opportunity to have two of the students and one of our teachers who we've worked with for many years interview the director, the sister, I'm blanking which one was.
It was Yusra.
Yusra, and then the actor who played the swim coach. So please check out the panel discussion. Again, thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's really so appreciated, and it just makes me think, Anthony, when you use that reference of love, can we give love? I often think that, every day we have the opportunity to be that person that someone else looks to and says, you know what, the world can be a great place, right? We have the opportunity to do that through actions big and small. So to the small actions, to storytelling, to conversations that humanize and create more empathy, I thank you all. And yeah, let's go have these conversations. Thank you so much.
You guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Porter.
Bye.
Bye.